Hello, and welcome to our second Poets in Conversation on the Mighty Blaze series. Today, we are honored to welcome two poets, Rebecca Morgan Frank and Will Harris. In a second, I'll introduce both poets, but first, I just want to give you both a warm welcome. It's really fun also to have an international guest today in Will, and also to celebrate with you, Morgan, the debut of your book, which just came out on the 19th. So it's just a newborn. So it's wonderful to have you both here. So I'll start just with some quick introductions, and then we'll get into some questions and discussions. And just a reminder for everybody watching, please feel free to pop any questions or comments in the comment box, and we'll be sure to pose them. We'll be talking for a little bit, and then we'll do some questions, and we'll get to all of the questions at the end. Rebecca Morgan Frank's fourth collection of poems is Oh You Robot Saints, and it looks like this. Beautiful book. Her previous collections are Sometimes We're All Living in a Foreign Country, The Spokes of Venus, and Little Murders Everywhere, which was finalist for the Kate Tufts Discovery Award, which is a big deal and lovely. Her poems have appeared in the New Yorker, American Poetry Review, Plowshares, 32 Poems, the Kenyon Review, Pleiades, the Southern Review, and so forth. She's the recipient of the Poetry Society of America's Alice Faye de Castagnola Award and fellowships from the Mississippi Arts Commission, the Virginia Center for Creative Arts, the Sewanee Writers Conference, the Ragdale Foundation, and the Writers' Room of Boston. Morgan is also co-founder and editor-in-chief of the online poetry magazine Memorious. Well-loved Memorious. Morgan also teaches in the MFA program in poetry and prose at Northwestern University's School of Professional Studies. And while she is a native of Charlottesville, Virginia, she is currently based in Chicago. The truth is in the job, not the wound, is one of Jericho Brown's favorite lines in Morgan's latest collection. He calls it a book in which the beauty, jealousy, and worship of the gods take center stage, and Brown names, quote, a commitment to showing us tragedy, as the Greeks would, through her indomitable use of second person, like a director giving instructions, coupled with what he calls full-on sapphic tenderness. He calls Morgan a poet of the exact and the harrowing. So welcome, Morgan. Will Harris is a writer of Chinese, Indonesian, and British heritage, born and based in London. His debut book, Rendang, is published by Granta in the UK and Wesleyan here in the US. It was a Poetry Book Society choice, was shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. These are huge prizes, you guys. It's an honor to host you. And Rendang won the Forward Prize for Best First Collections. Congratulations. Will co-edited the spring 2020 issue of the Poetry Review with Mary Jean Chan. Obvious, says one reviewer, is Harris's fondness of sound. As a poet, he would follow it anywhere, it seems, such is his reverence for it. There's at once the sense of mechanical integration occurring, of tiny bones clicking into place, as well as a sense of wonder in the unfolding, wherein what is rootless at one level is becoming rooted at another, and the arbitrary of one moment is found in the next to be curiously charged with meaning. It's an honor to host you both. Welcome to A Mighty Blaze. So I thought we could just get started talking in broad terms about the books, about kind of what you learned and what you discovered. I was just talking with my students last night about this, the need for discovery and openness to uncertainty in writing poems and in writing a collection. So I thought maybe we could hear from both of you about that. What surprised you?
Morgan?
Yeah, I can start. So much of my conversation, so much of my work comes out of conversation, right? That is like listening to the work of other people, researching all the scholars and artists and automaton makers throughout history. So this really was a place of literal discovery, right? Of finding things that I didn't know existed, stories that I didn't know existed, both literary and made. On a more personal level, as always with writing poems, you often set out writing about one thing and it is about something else. And so as I was starting to research this book and write this book, I lost my mother. And so the first poems that I wrote were, just set the path of the book of being elegiac, and I hadn't expected that. So there were all kinds of twists and turns, some which were curiosity and wonder, this strange world of automata and leading into robots. And that, I'll say, that was the other surprise, was I really was only interested in looking backwards. And then I was introduced to a roboticist, and I started writing a poem about robo-bees, and he introduced me to the idea of soft robots. And the next thing I know, robots had kind of elbowed their way into the book, the robots we live among now. So a lot of discovery in this, in many different kinds of ways. How about you, Will?
Yeah, I love kind of framing it in terms of discovery. Oh, and by the way, I love the Ode to the Robo-Bee. That's maybe in my top 3 poems in your book. Yeah. And yeah, there's a real sense of discovery in that poem as well. The way you use that kind of, it's kind of loosely like a crown of sonnets.
Yeah.
And the way that form is just continually kind of like, kind of extending and exploding and discovering new things in the repetition. I guess what you were saying made me realize that there was also a death in the writing of my book, which was my my grandma on my Indonesian side. She passed away as I was writing the book, probably about maybe 2 years before it was published. So kind of at the point when I was really bringing everything together and working on the final poems that were going to make up the shape of the book. And I think it was one of those things which maybe, I don't know, just like when a kind of bit of debris hits a comet and just like knocks it off course slightly, it just like kind of like altered the trajectory of the book and probably did give it a more elegiac slant. I think a lot of it was already about me kind of processing this gap which my grandma represented. So it was a kind of strange literalization of it for her to be dead. So in a way, it didn't really change the content. But anyway, I don't know how this relates to discovery, but one of the big things I did in the couple of years I was like intensely working on the book was to try and open myself up in terms of the process of writing to a kind of not automatic writing in that kind of like surrealist sense, but a kind of much freer kind of style, because my earlier habits of writing were very kind of obsessive and like kind of technical, and so for me a big discovery was kind of like breaking myself open, or that's how it felt like, to just to what came, and kind of taking my like day-to-day life as a starting point for that. So just like writing about London and stuff I saw or did or watched or read, and just giving myself the freedom to do that, not feeling like I needed to kind of overly transform it. Like there's one poem which starts with a quote from a Ben Jonson poem, and I think if I'd been trying to write that a few years before, I would have tried to integrate it in, or I would have thought that was a really kind of pretentious opening. But then I kind of had this realization that actually it would be maybe more pretentious or more untrue to pretend that wasn't part of the fabric of the poem.
Yeah.
So that was kind of a discovery for me. It was quite freeing. But yeah. Anyway,
I have a related question for you guys about that. In both of your books, especially yours, Will, you sort of toy with breaking the fourth wall. And I'm wondering if, Morgan, for you in this book and in others, and Will, for you especially in this book, when do you find yourselves wanting to name the act of writing, to sort of disclose the act of writing and the process of artifice? And when do you feel like you're shying away from that?
One of my favorite poets and critics is this, I don't know if she's as popular in the US. Her name's Veronica Forrest Thompson. She died tragically young. She's Scottish originally, died in the 70s. And she wrote this book called Poetic Artifice. And the basic argument is that every poem is about writing a poem, that it's like the most self-aware art form. And it's whether you want to draw attention to the fact or not, I think, which to me is the distinction. And I personally like it. I know it's like a workshop maxim, never, not to write, not to write about writing, or not to not to use the word poem in a poem. But to me, if it's done well, you're just alluding to a process that's already happening and including the reader in it. And it can be a very generous gesture, I think. What about you, Morgan?
Yeah, I think, you use the phrase, if it's done well, and that's the catch. I don't do it in part because it isn't to say that it hasn't happened in my notebooks, but it never gets further than that. And, I just really admire the way that is happening in your work, Will, and the sort of conversational, as you talked about, kind of moving through London, and look at we're right there with you. I think there's so much compression in my work that I think it's harder to make space for that in the kinds of poems I'm writing in this book, and most of the poems in my other books as well. That it would be a pretty jarring, interjection. I think the only time I've done that is I wrote an Ars Poetica when collaborating with a composer once at his request, but it's never sort of come naturally into the work. And yet, as there's so many incredible poems where this does work successfully. So it's that reminder, there are no no's. It's just, if you're going to do it, I think that's a harder one to fail at. Readers are going to pounce on it more easily for failure than maybe other kinds of failures.
But it's interesting, but it makes me think of the Jericho Brown comment that Allison, that you quoted, about your use of the second person. When you're writing in the second person, though, who are you thinking of? Are you not partly thinking of the reader and therefore of yourself as both a poet and also a person in the poem, which is kind of doing that trick already?
Yeah, I mean, that the you of the third person is so slippery and wonderful, and that it can be sometimes the I, it can be sometimes standing in for any person, or it can be addressed to the reader. I think my you is more universal often, that embraces maybe me and the reader. So I love that observation, that's maybe the way I try to kind of welcome them in. And other times the you is an address as well. But yeah, that's interesting.
It seems to me, Morgan, that you must have had a lot of your research into automata and robots, ultimately, and robots too, must have led you to some really pretty wacky discoveries. I'm just wondering what some of the zanier research, or what really, was there anything that sort of shocked you about the history of automata? And I was shocked to find out about the bee, the digesting duck, the mechanical virgins, etc. I had no idea these things existed.
Yeah, I think there's so much. I mean, the wondrous, certainly as kind of comes out in the title, all the sort of religious figures. I went to an amazing exhibit in London at the Science Museum, the robot exhibit. I don't know if you got a chance to see that, Will, but it was, across the periods. And, one of those is, if we might broaden the idea of the automata, Christ that's bleeding blood, but, there's stories of all, classical automata, they're literary automata. One of my poems, The Archer in the Tomb, is, there's an automata in French medieval romances. So yeah, the digesting duck is up there. I would say another really peculiar one, it's gotten a lot of attention in literature, is the automaton Turk, which was really a false automaton. It was people were believing that, that this was a mechanical chess player, and yet there were actual chess players crouched down in the cabinet pulling levers. So it's been pretty amazing to consider those. Also, the story of Descartes making an automaton daughter that, got thrown overboard as he was sailing to Sweden. I mean, the stories just abound. I think when I first opened Ellie Truitt's Medieval Robots, I'm doing a conversation with her at Porter Square Books next month, and I'm so excited to get her telling stories. It's a really wonderful and peculiar world. And I guess the last thing I would say is one of the things that's been really wonderful is to find out how many other people are sort of obsessed or interested in this world in different disciplines. So they'll say like, oh, wait, this comes up in theater history, and this comes up in dance history, and this comes up in this novel and this period and this country. And that's how I found a lot of my leads. And I think it's a fascinating and curious also to see this human thread of a desire to create life, whether it's human or creature. So yeah, that's the short answer, in that I originally think I had envisioned the book as a bestiary of just all these strange stories. And in the end, not all of them, of course, made it into poems, but I encourage people to go out and reach for more.
Can I ask if a poem if there was an initial poem that then kind of sparked the interest, or if it came with that idea, the bestiary or the...
Yeah, I think a little of both. My husband is a medieval theater historian, and one day I looked down on the coffee table and there was a book called Medieval Robots. That's the Ellie Truitt book I was talking about. I picked it up and started reading it, and I couldn't stop. And so then that led me, I think the first poem was actually about, this is a strange story for you, Gerbert Aurillac, who ended up being Pope, and that he had created this talking head that had prophesied that he would become Pope, and also that he would die in Jerusalem, which he did, but it was a church called Jerusalem. So I think that was maybe the seed poem. It's funny going back, trying to decide what really was the first poem, but I think the talking head sort of got me going, and the automaton monk, but also just, it's like I had opened a portal, and there was this world I was wandering into, and I pretty immediately thought this would make a pretty magical drawing board, for writing poems.
There's this strange combination of a desire for duplication and companionship in automata, or in the creation of automata and robotics, but then also the control means there's none of the wildness. There's none of the wildness and the freshness. And I have a question that's sort of related about your book, Will, which is, what you were describing before, Morgan, about people who get really kind of obsessive about something, which probably all of us can relate to. I found at times, Will, in your book, the voice of the poem seemed to be pulling back and trying to paint as much with the blank space or with restraint as it did with the words that came out. I don't know if that's something that resonates with you, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit, if it resonates with you, about using restraint in the book as a kind of messaging.
I don't know how conscious it is. Kind of like I was saying earlier about trying to write in this different, more open, automatic way. I feel like I basically just have two modes of writing poems, at the moment at least, or that I'm aware of. And one of them is just very pared down and more kind of maybe conventionally lyric and sound patterned, and the other is more kind of freewheeling and conversational, and I've been trying to experiment with blurring the line between them. And I guess sequences are the main way I've found, which kind of allow me to do a bit of both. Like I have a sequence called The White Jumper, which was based on this dream I had. This really boring dream I had about seeing a white jumper, and I used this as a kind of template to keep a kind of a journal of different things I saw or read, which tangentially related to it, where I could incorporate the lyric and more conversational journalistic modes. But in terms of restraint, I guess if I think about it in terms of using the page, that was something that my editor, Rachel Allen, really helped me to see, which wasn't there so much in the first draft of the book. Ways in which I could arrange the text on the page, ways in which I could combine poems, just think about the layout and how the layout could transform the text. And that was quite a big thing for me.
Well,
oh, please go ahead, Morgan.
Oh, I'm just curious. Thanks to follow up on the dreams. I'm really interested to hear about your process from taking dream into poem. Like, do you keep a dream journal? How much of those fragments of language in the poem are early on, or what's? I'm just sort of fascinated by the way you make the conceit of the dream work so well in these poems.
Well, in that poem, I did just have one dream, which was about me running along in a forest and then seeing a white jumper which I couldn't reach. It was on a plinth that was a bit too far away for me to jump to, and so I decided to use it, maybe in the style of an ekphrastic poem, as the subject for just an extended series of riffs on it. And while I was working on that poem, I also was quite open to other dreams. So dreams I came across in books, dreams that friends told me, and I often just transposed them and put them directly into it. But the dream thing is interesting. A friend of mine, a really great poet called Sophie Collins, she said that she gets annoyed when people think that the dreams she writes about are her actual dreams. Because I mean, her response is that she's a poet. Why would she just write her own dreams? And I don't quite subscribe to that, because I do literally write my own dreams, because I quite enjoy writing really banal dreams. But I think you can often tell when something is a literary dream, because it obviously has a level of artifice and complexity that real dreams don't. And it's very hard to write the texture of a real dream, because you'd also need to dismantle syntax to try and create that sense of things merging into each other and all of that. But I'm fascinated by it too.
I'm wondering too, it seems like some of the silences of the blank space, as you say, as the poems are sort of spread out on the page, they suggest a kind of unfinished quality, or a kind of incompleteness, where there are the things that we know and then the things that happen between the bits that we do know. I have a related question for both of you, but I thought maybe we could hear a poem from each of you first, just to give people a taste of what they're in for in reading your beautiful books. Maybe we could start with you, Will, if you'd be up for it.
Yeah, of course. Okay. This is a poem called State Building. And I don't really think you need to know anything before. State building. Break a vase, says Derek Walcott, and the love that reassembles the fragments will be stronger than that love which took its symmetry for granted. When I read this, I can only think, who broke it? In the British Museum, two black figures, they don't say slaves, beat olives from a tree. A naked youth stoops to gather the fallen fruit. The freeborn men elsewhere, safe behind their porticos, argue about the world's true form, or talk of bee glue, used to seal the hive against attack, later called propolis, meaning that it has to come before, is crucial for the building of a state. Here, it's summer, and bees groan inside the carcass of a split bin bag. A figure passes, is close to past, when I see her face, half shadow marked with sweat or tears. The folds beneath each downcast eye the same light brown as oceans of my grandma, Ma. Give me a love that's unassimilated, sharp as broken pots, that can't be taken, granted. My dad would work among the blue and white pieces of a Ming vase, his job to get it passable. He'd gather every bit, and after days assembling, filling in, putty, spit, glue, draw forth not sweetness, something new.
I love that poem. I'm so glad you agreed to read it. And I felt that in that poem, as in much of the book, in both of your books, there was a kind of specter of, political concern. In State Building, not as much of a specter, pretty much a presence. But Morgan, would you read a poem for us too?
Sure. That was That was so beautiful, Will. Like Allison, I love that poem and the way it moves. And really, I was sitting here thinking, I can't wait to teach that poem, and in the beautiful way that it moves. And all right, so this is I'm going to read a poem based on the monk who you see x-rayed on the cover of the book, and the title is "Monk Automaton, circa 1560." 1. Looking at you now is like seeing a god or a king naked and starving in a field. Stripped of your damask robe and wooden limbs, you've been skimmed to the iron spine that stems your clockwork to your cracked face. This is when you are most mortal. 2. You could hold him in both hands, a key turn spiriting a clockwork miracle, each supplicant kneeling to his absence of breath, blessed by his cams and levers, the secrets beneath his robes. Mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa. His poplar jaw drops prayer, shuts in a wooden cross kiss of his right hand beats the absence of a heart. He wears the face of Saint Didacus, the tripod wheels of Hephaestus, son of the gods, father of the future. The monk almost floats. 3. Robots can do almost anything you please. They are up on sexual favors, cordless vacuuming, and martyring themselves by bomb. Less effective at deep tissue massage, excellent at listening to senior citizens, working on parking your cars. What the future brings is nothing we haven't seen in this quest to be little gods and make what will do our bidding. The medieval monk who doled out benedictions arose from a ruler's dream and was then fathered by a clockmaker. The real monk now sits alone in the back room, smokes a cigar, enjoys a glass of whiskey. He's outsourced the job. The real monk is on the dole. The real monk is waiting in the parking lot for offers of day labor. The real monk is unloading boxes at Costco. The real monk sits in the factory, building himself by hand.
Thank you, Morgan.
Thanks for requesting that one.
So I wanted to ask, from everything you've learned, how is building a robot like writing a poem? An obvious question, but one I find I'm very interested in.
Yeah, I mean, when I think I'm sort of fascinated with other makers even more than their makings. I feel like that was kind of what drove me in the Spokes of Venus. Like, how do artists think? And then what do roboticists think? And I think that idea of, it's a similar drive of wanting to understand something and breaking it down and building it back up. You know, what does it mean if a roboticist wants to understand how to make a bee fly or how to make robotic bees fly together, right? That sense of wonder that's driving them. We do the same thing with the poem, right? This creature, this poem is wonderful. I'm going to break it down, see how it works. And then from there, you're taking what you're learning, but you're also bringing your own sense of invention and wonder. And I think just as if we give the same subject to a lineup of poems, you know, I imagine it's the same of roboticists, right? It's all going to look different. And we can see that in the history of all kinds of making that are driven by wonder, at least.
I love the idea, too, that there's a spark that's going to come at some point that makes the difference between machine and something else animated. So, Will, I have a related question for you. I don't want to, if you guys want to ask each other things, I don't want to step on your toes, but I have a related question for you about your poem, The Break. You mentioned writing into the break, and I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about what it means to write into the break.
Well, that poem came out of reading Fred Moten's incredible book, In the Break, which is about jazz and the Black radical tradition. And so a break within jazz has a particular meaning, which is it's when the band drops back and the soloist kind of just improvises. And so writing into the break, I guess, which is something Fred Moten does in his own amazing kind of semi-improvisatory critical prose, is, yeah, it's when you're kind of letting yourself be in the groove, I guess, and you're letting the kind of different ideas and be dictated by the kind of rhythms of the poem. And it has a particular meaning for me within poetry because of the line break itself. I mean, I think of the line break as being the main constitutive gesture of the poem. And I think it seems like an obvious thing, but I think it's the thing that's hardest about poems, right? You know, that you could take a piece of prose that anyone would look at and read normally, and you just put line breaks in and people go, oh God, it's a poem, you know, get it away from me. But I think it's because it kind of upsets something quite fundamental in us, which is to see a text, you know, something almost like physically broken apart. And so I'm also interested in the idea of writing, what it means to try and write into that break, to kind of give it a kind of texture. And yeah, I mean, breaks just have a great idea. I was also probably thinking of, maybe I just read Anne Carsten's Sappho translations, and the way she writes about, she has this description of these fragments of Sappho being like spooky splinters. And I love that idea that, you know, they lead into the silence of the page, and there's a spookiness to them, which is exciting. And maybe that comes back to what you were saying about restraint. You want to give a space around the poem which attests to its brokenness, which attests to this thing which is more than it. But also the concept of break is so huge and all-encompassing that I could kind of say I could like waffle about it for hours. But yeah, exciting.
So I just want to remind everyone watching that they should feel free to put questions in the chat for our guests. We're going to move in just about a minute or two into the Q&A portion. So I know it was such a gift that you guys sort of gave this event and each other in reading each other's books ahead of time. I was wondering what struck you most about each other's work.
I feel like I was just speaking. Yeah. I don't want to put you first.
But yeah. I'm happy to. Like this book was such a wonderful discovery, and I feel like I'm rereading and going back into it. And I think something that you articulated earlier about sort of bridging these two kinds of poems is what really struck me, right? That the musicality and lyricism that you're able to bring into that conversational wandering, right? I really found to be quite magical. Also, the range of invention in here. I think when I say invention, I think it feels really formally fresh to me in a way that it's using the line, and I'm really interested in how a poem moves, right? That it's a mind at work, and this is a mind I wanted to follow, through the streets of London. And also, there's so many. I kept jotting down this just beautiful lines in here. Just all the birds are your husband. There are these moments. There must be some hard limit to language. To stop a thing from living is to kill a thing. This sound stopped in my throat is not a word, but could be. And then this lives in the same poem where Stan says later, she scolded the wife in her most mocking poem yet. No, all the birds are your husband. It's like the life force in these poems of the speaker and where the mind goes. And I always felt the surety of your hand, right? Like I could give in to the wanderings and was rewarded at the end of each poem. So yeah, the white jumper, I think, is just tremendous, the way it moves. To me, that was a real standout, and the poem that you read as well. working in just two different modes and living in this book. So I could go on about this, but I just I have to say the voice and the formal invention, and I think it's just, steadily delivers. Sounds like a cheesy line for it, but I felt that like I kept renewedly being surprised and fulfilled, which is what I want from a book of poems. So that's my fangirl expression.
I feel like I've set you guys up to blush at each other.
But I did mean all that, Will. I really did.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. That really means a lot. You kind of don't really know when you're, especially when you're writing poetry, whether anyone will ever see, let alone kind of get what you're trying to do. So yeah, to have someone read and
isn't it a different experience to be read by other poets too? Because a lot of people will read poems and fairly will want to read them for the content, the stories, but when another poet is reading your poems, they're picking up on every little thing, every line break, every sort of flexible dual reading of a word, etc.
We know how hard the thing is that someone has pulled off, right? Like, oh, that I see what you did there. That's amazing,
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing I loved in your book, well, the conceit was just incredible. I mean, the way you sustain it. I mean, personally speaking, I find it very difficult to. That my book is kind of a litany of failed projects where I ran aground after a few poems. But the ways in which you managed to keep drawing the rabbit out of the hat, amazing. And also the way that what's so great about the robot, the automata conceit, is the way it provides this this meeting point for different tones and registers. I guess, yeah, and there's something in your voice as well, which is very welcoming and entrancing, almost like, it's a poem about this, almost like a magician. Look at this automata, look at this, and then behind the scenes, or like you were saying with the people manning the automata underneath, there's something tragic and also or just very human and personal. It's kind of beating heart. And those shifts in register are so hard to do, but so amazingly achieved. And it's so powerful to me when you can do that, when you can surprise the reader with something, with an image, with a conceit like that. I guess the RoboBee one was one I mentioned earlier. The way you do that consistently, and that the way the repetition works in that is just particularly brilliant. The way it comes back to the RoboBee, the way the lines repeat, so you have this sense actually of it being almost like a monologue, where the speaker is trying not to talk about this thing. You kind of bookend on either side of the poems about the death of your mother and this sense, and about having children, and there are these kind of big weighty things, and yet you've got this person talking about RoboBees, and it kind of comes back to that. And I love that the kind of the juncture between those two things. It just creates very moving work. I often think of one of the ways of thinking about a poem is or maybe one of the things I find myself doing when I write and when I work, is that I'll set up two things in order to try and express another thing which is kind of in between them, which I think your poems do really well. And
so we have a bunch of people who agree with both of you in your assessments, and have not only beautiful comments and compliments, but also some questions. So maybe we can start with this question from Suna. Does your relationship to the poems change once they're out in the world? What's next for the both of you? Your latest preoccupations? So a few questions in there. Maybe we can start with the first. How does your relationship to the poems change once the poems are out in the world? That's a great question.
I think it's funny because, when a book is first out, you're sort of, I'm sort of navigating it right now, right? It's like this new relationship, stepping out into the world with a book and reading the poems. And but of course, they've been emissaries out in journals ahead of time. But as always, I think, you know, you look back and I see them through different lenses. One thing is I feel like I exposed a lot more in this book. It's interesting to me that I wrote a book about robots, and it feels like deeply personal. And I think as I start to bring the poems out to the world, you know, face to face over screens, I'm kind of aware of that. But yeah, like I said, still sort of figuring out what my relationship to these new poems grouped together this way are. How about you, Will?
I would say they do change, and they change multiple times once they're out in the world. My initial response to the book being published was, I guess, a feeling of self disgust. Maybe there was a lot of, I had a lot of shame around it, which I've talked to other writers. Apparently, this isn't that uncommon, and it took me a while to adjust to the fact that this book and these poems represented me in the world, and they weren't just a ball of potential in my head. And even when they've been published in magazines, they're still, in a sense, they still were in my head, you know, and they still could be changed and edited and made into a new shape. And so I had to live with the fact that they were real, and I couldn't touch them anymore. And so it's been, I feel like enough time has passed that I feel like I've come to appreciate them on their own merits, and that's helped by working on new things. For me, I know other people respond differently. I wanted to immediately write lots more to try and push myself forward, and having written new things, I feel better about that work now. It felt necessary to me when I was working on it, and that's nice. And maybe in a few years I'll change again how I feel about it.
It makes me think of how the poet Bill Knott you would go to a reading, and he didn't think the poem had finished once it was out in the book. He would have revised the poems, put them in a Xerox little pamphlet, and hand it out at the readings. And I sort of love that idea, give it permission that maybe even if it's only in our heads, we're still revising away. It's a funny process though of letting go.
Yeah,
I do that. I do that. I'll read a poem differently at a reading. I feel like there's a little bit of Play-Doh in there. You know, the poem transcends the page somehow. It exists outside and it's rendered a few different ways.
And that's why pamphlets are great, and self-printing. I love the ephemerality of them. You can get an idea out there and share it. Whereas a book, there is something different. It does become a commodity in a weird way, and you, by extension, also become a commodity in a way that it took me a while to get my head around.
You know, the other thing that's funny about that, though, is I don't know if either of you have had this experience where the version you have in a magazine is different than the version in the book, which would maybe, it's not that hasn't happened before, but with the internet, it becomes a little more obvious. It's like having different lives simultaneously out in the world, which we probably, those of us who teach college, notice, because sometimes when students take the version offline rather than from the book, and that's always interesting when that happens, and it's different versions.
I find that comes up a lot too in slam poetry and spoken word that is either previously published in print or rendered after the fact in print. One of my favorite poems is The Sky Now Black with Birds by Jamal May. And I heard him recite and perform the poem at 8 a.m. or something one morning at AWP, and it was miraculous. I went to find it. There's a different version through Button Poetry that's available. That's a great version. And then there's at least a third version, which is the print version through, I think, Kenyon Review is where it was published. And words are different, patterns are different, but it seems to be something where in the moment, the passionate delivery of it has required a different patterning, which I sort of admire that idea that, the poet is so inhabiting the poem that maybe he's not beholden to what was on the page at some point. We have some more questions. Let's see. Here's one. Winston Lynn asks, what have been the favorite creative projects you've been a part of? You want to start with this, Morgan? I know you've had people work with composers, etc. You've done a lot of collaborations.
Sure. Yeah, I would say, I mean, just the real joy of my creative life has been those collaborations. It started in my role as editor, bringing together poets and composers for Art Song, and then I've worked with a half dozen different composers in different ways. Sometimes they're just setting my poem. Sometimes it's active collaboration, electroacoustic or art songs. And I find it just really incredibly inspiring and to kind of connect not only with their creative processes, but their different communities. So I've gotten to know not only all these composers, but now like there's this incredible singer, Morgan Enan, who has sung some of my poems from different composers. So now I find myself following her, and I think it's just nice to sort of break open the insular literariness of my world. So it's magic to me when poets and composers come together with other people's work as well. Yeah. How about you, Will?
Yeah, I haven't had the opportunity to do as many exciting creative projects in that way. I've had a few commissions, but I don't think they're as they're still solitary, even if you're part of a group of writers. But then I think I've been part of several writing communities, or small communities, and those feel like creative projects to me too.
Will, how I came across you initially was at that event with Caroline Bergvall.
Yeah, okay, that's true. That was a great creative project.
That was great.
I knew that loads of stuff was in my mind. Yeah, Caroline Bergvall set up an amazing one-night live writing event where we several poets, it was based around the different stages of the night, and we rewrote a series of linked poems based loosely on the Renga. That was amazing. Yeah, it'd be great to do more of that. Yeah.
Yeah, that was on the spot while the sun was setting and rising in different parts of the world, sort of simultaneously. Different lines were coming up, and then everyone was adding lines to each other. So it was pretty fascinating. So we have another question here from Winston, a helpful question. And I think Suna asked something similar before. What creative projects are upcoming for you, if any? What do you have in mind? Morgan, your book just came out, but how are you? What are you thinking about doing next? And you too, Will.
Okay, I can go first this time. I am not. I mean, I'm just writing more poems. I'm actually trying to write something which is a more sustained and consistent book length project, which is about the idea of alternative or imagined families. So I'm writing a series of poems about different moments from my life as if I had a brother, and I'm going to hopefully build this into a kind of series of mini pamphlets about my relationship with this brother, which interlink into a larger book. And it's quite complicated at this stage, but it's been, that's been the main thing I've been working on.
I learned that Salvador Dali had an older brother who passed before he was born, and the older brother was also named Salvador. And he spoke and wrote about how this sort of outline figure in his life became a kind of companion, creative and intellectual companion, this like dual self persona, for what it's worth. So I'll be very in line to read your pamphlets that are coming up. How about you, Morgan?
I'm just still stuck on, I love that idea of the individual pamphlets becoming a book, and I can't wait to see what that means. My dream press is, I've always wanted to create one where we get like a box set of poets' work, and that seems to me like a minimal version of that. So I have been, it's hard for many of us, I think, to start a new project during the pandemic because I am so inspired by external things. But I have been writing poems and sort of formulating a possible book project around this that it's shaped into about architecture, reading about failed architecture. So I've been having a lot of fun, and maybe because I'm looking at these same four walls, looking at pictures and reading about architecture. And I guess it is an extension of another kind of making, and buildings that have failed, buildings that have fallen, buildings that have never been filled, and defensive architecture, right? And the role of architecture in war, forensic architecture. This sort of, I'm in the fascinating reading and gathering tidbits and starting the first poems for this. So we'll see what comes of it. But this is my favorite part, which is that, anything is possible, and I'm reading anything I can get my hands on. And I think I use poetry as a way to shape my reading. In many ways.
I want to thank you both so much for talking with us today. And as you can see, I think anyone who has appreciated this conversation, which I'm sure is many, many people, please check us out, A Mighty Blaze, on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to learn about future events. We're doing Poets in Conversation once a month. Before we wrap up, you guys, not only do I want to thank you, but before we wrap up, I would love to hear from each of you, if you wouldn't mind, some poets you're really excited about. I know that there's at least some students who are watching and are planning to watch later, and it's always fun to hear who excites you and what poets you feel like should be getting more love and attention. Would you like to start, Will?
Yeah, sure. Okay. I did have a little think about this poem because every time I'm asked on the spot, I always forget everything in the world.
Too overwhelming. There's so many people.
Yeah, But recent discoveries, at least, poets that I love include the Japanese poet Hiromi Ita, whose first book, Killing Kanoko, I think is published by Action Books in the US, is absolutely incredible. And just really kind of just vivid, brutal, honest, incantatory poems. I'd also recommend a poet called Wong Mei, who has a book called Picasso's Tears, which was published by Octopus Books in the US. In fact, yeah, it's published by US, even though she's she's a Singaporean poet who lives in Ireland at the moment. But she published 3 books in the 70s and then didn't publish anything until this book, which collects all the poems she's been writing since then. And she's incredible, like a complete original who should have a much wider readership. And I'd always recommend Vani Capildeo, who's a pretty big deal over here, but I don't know if she's that widely read in the US. I don't even know if she has a US publisher. But Vani's work is absolutely essential. The best book to start with is probably Measures of Expatriation. But yeah, it's all good. It's all good.
Thank you. Morgan, how about you?
I'm going to replay this video and take notes from Will's suggestions here. It's funny, I've been spending my day thinking about books coming out from contributors to the magazine and books ahead. But a few that come to mind for 2021 books that are, I really love Derek Austin's first book, and he has a second collection coming out from BOA this fall. Sandra Lim, who's just an incredible poet, has a new book coming out with Norton. And so those are ones I'm kind of on my excited to read list. There's so many, but 2 that also have been on my mind right now is the poet Akilah Oliver, who is no longer with us. Her book, The She Said Dialogues, just got reissued by Nightboat Books, and I'm really hoping that it's going to introduce a lot more people to her. My first poetry workshop was like a 2-hour workshop in a feminist bookstore that she led. And so I feel indebted to her, but also just really excited revisiting her work. It feels incredibly timely. And I just wrote a review of a book that I loved, Wa Win's 1,000 Times to Lose Your Treasure from Wave Books. It's about her mother was a flying motorcycle artist in Vietnam in the 50s, and that it doesn't do it full justice to say that, but I find that I'm really being drawn to some poets that are much more different than what I'm doing right now. Something about my pandemic reading habits. I loved the spaciousness and innovation of those. So I think 2021 is going to be a really great year for books. I'm pretty excited about a lot of the things coming down the pike from what we already know is on the board.
Well, thank you both again. As you said, I'm going to go back and take notes and get a good reading list going. I hope anyone watching might decide to pop some recommendations also in the comment section, so we get recommendations from everywhere. And speaking of what's coming down the pike, let me just say very exciting news, which is next month for March, we'll be talking with John Murillo and Carolyn Forche. So I hope everyone who's here will follow A Mighty Blaze to find out information about that and will join us again. Thank you so much to Will and Morgan. We really appreciate your conversation today and look forward to talking with you again.
Thank you so much, Allison, for having us here.
And let's not forget to show everyone again those beautiful books. I want people to be able to recognize them when they go to the store. Thank you both.